Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. I wasn't supposed to be there. I knew that from the moment I stepped off the trail, the warnings buzzing in the back of my head like an irritating gnat. The signs had been clear. Stay on marked paths. Report all strange sightings. But something about the solitude of the woods had pulled me in deeper until I was miles away from the main campsite. That's what I wanted after all. Peace, no people, just me and the forest. The sun was sinking fast behind the trees, casting long shadows across the underbrush. The air had that sticky, cool bite that comes just before dusk, and I knew I had to set up camp soon. It wasn't my first time camping alone, but the isolation felt different this time. The woods were thicker here, the sounds more muted, as if the trees themselves were listening. I found a small clearing perfect for my tent and a little fire. I was halfway through setting up when I heard it. The unmistakable crunch of footsteps. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. They were distant but deliberate, and they didn't belong to any animal. They were too heavy for that. "Hello?" I called, but my voice felt weak against the growing night. There was no response, just the sound of those footsteps getting closer, then stopping suddenly. The forest went eerily quiet again. I shook it off. Probably just another camper off the trail, I thought, though I hadn't seen anyone all day. There was something comforting about that idea. Another human being out here. That thought, however, quickly dissolved when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. At first, I couldn't quite place what I was seeing, just a flash of movement, too fast and too far to make out. But there was something wrong about it. The way it moved, low to the ground, almost crawling, but with a fluidity that made my skin crawl. I turned fully toward the spot where I'd seen it, flashlight ready, but there was nothing there, just trees and the encroaching darkness. I swallowed hard and got back to setting up camp, trying to push the growing unease from my mind. By the time the fire was crackling, the woods had become a shadowy maze. The sounds had returned, night birds calling out, the rustling of leaves, the distant hum of the wind. But something still felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. An hour passed, maybe more. I was lost in thought, staring into the flames, when the snap of a branch made me jerk upright. This time the sound was closer, much closer. I shot up, grabbed my flashlight, and swung the beam in a wide arc around the campsite. The light cut through the dark, but revealed only trees and undergrowth. My heart pounded in my ears. "Who's out there?" I shouted, hoping my voice didn't betray my fear. The silence that followed was absolute, crushing. Then a voice answered, a low, raspy whisper that made my blood turn cold. "Help me." I blinked, unsure if I'd actually heard it. The voice was so faint, so wrong. It was human, but warped, like someone who hadn't spoken in years was trying to remember how. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice trembling now. The response was immediate, closer than before. "Please, help me." I swept the flashlight around frantically, trying to pinpoint the source. My heart leaped into my throat when the light caught something. Eyes glowing faintly in the dark, low to the ground. They blinked, and then they were gone, vanishing into the blackness. I backed up toward the fire, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My mind raced, searching for an explanation. A trick of the light? An animal? But the voice, it had been human. I was sure of it. Another snap, this time directly behind me. I spun around, light shaking in my hand, and froze. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a man. Or at least, it looked like a man. His face was gaunt, the skin stretched too tightly over his bones, his eyes sunken and hollow. His clothes were torn, ragged, hanging from his thin frame like they didn't belong to him. "Help me," he rasped again, but his lips didn't move. The voice was coming from him, but it was all wrong, like a ventriloquist's puppet. He took a step forward, his limbs jerky, unnatural. I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking wildly in my hand. I can get help, I stammered. I'll call someone. Just stay there. But he didn't stop. Another step and then another, his movements becoming faster, more erratic. As he approached, I realized with dawning horror that his skin, it wasn't right. It was shifting, sliding over his muscles like a loose sheet, like it didn't quite fit. I turned and bolted, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face. My only thought was to run, to get away from whatever that thing was. The footsteps behind me were fast, impossibly fast, keeping pace with me no matter how hard I pushed myself. That awful voice echoed through the trees, distorted and wrong. "Help me! Don't leave me!" I didn't stop, couldn't stop. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I ran until I burst out onto the main trail, the dirt path suddenly familiar and grounding. I skidded to a halt, gasping for air, and turned to look behind me. Nothing. The woods were empty, quiet. I didn't stick around to question it. I sprinted back toward the ranger station, desperate for the safety of lights, of people. When I burst through the door, breathless and wild-eyed, the ranger on duty looked up from his desk, startled. "You all right, buddy?" he asked, his brow furrowed. I tried to explain, the words tumbling out of me in a frantic mess. "There's something out there, a man but not a man. He was chasing me. His skin, it wasn't right." The ranger's face darkened, and he stood slowly, grabbing a flashlight from his desk. "You weren't off the trail, were you?" he asked, his tone low. I nodded, my pulse still pounding in my ears. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "You're lucky you made it back. Most don't." What was that thing?" I asked, still shaking. The ranger glanced toward the window as if expecting to see something lurking in the dark. Then he turned back to me, his eyes cold, almost sad. "You've heard of skinwalkers, right?" I shook my head, but I'd heard the stories, the legends. Just campfire tales, I'd thought. "They're real," he said flatly, "and they don't like people wandering into their territory." I felt the blood drain from my face. "But you're here. It can't follow me, right?" The ranger gave me a long, hard look, and then, without a word, he slowly began to peel off his skin. His eyes gleamed, black as pitch. "Who says I didn't?" I never believed in the stories, the ones about the woods near my hometown. I'd heard the legends growing up, tales of strange creatures and lost souls that lurked between the trees, but they were always just that, stories. Local folklore, passed down through generations to scare kids from wandering too far into the forest. I thought they were harmless, just ghost tales to spice up campfires. That all changed last fall. It was supposed to be a quick overnight camping trip. Just me, my buddy Tom, and a couple of beers by the fire. We'd done it before, nothing special. The trail we took was one that people rarely used anymore, leading deep into the heart of the forest. We wanted solitude, and we got it. By the time we set up camp, the sun was sinking behind the trees, casting long, thin shadows across the clearing. The forest seemed unnaturally still. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just quiet. I tried not to let it bother me, but there was something about the way the silence hung in the air that felt wrong. Tom didn't seem to notice, though. He was cracking jokes, making light of the isolation. As night fell, the fire crackled and popped, casting a warm glow around our little camp. Tom and I sat there laughing and swapping stories, trying to ignore the way the woods seemed to close in around us. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often I'd catch myself glancing into the trees, half expecting to see someone or something standing there, hidden in the darkness. Around midnight, Tom decided to take a walk. He said he wanted to stretch his legs, maybe take a piss, and would be back in a few minutes. I didn't think much of it at the time. I stayed by the fire, feeding it more wood, letting the warmth chase away the chill that was creeping into my bones. Minutes passed, then 20, then 30. Tom hadn't come back, and I stood up, grabbing the flashlight from my pack, and called out his name. No answer. Just the wind stirring through the branches overhead, whispering like a voice I couldn't quite make out. A knot of unease formed in my stomach as I shined the light into the forest, illuminating nothing but trees and darkness. I called for him again, louder this time, my voice echoing through the night. Still nothing. My heart started to pound. Tom wasn't the type to wander off without a word, especially not in the middle of the night in unfamiliar woods. I stepped toward the edge of the clearing, the flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. The beam danced over the undergrowth, casting long shadows that twisted and stretched like they were alive. "Tom!" I shouted, my voice breaking the oppressive silence. And then I heard it, a voice, faint, almost muffled, coming from deep within the forest. "Help me!" It was Tom's voice, weak and shaky, like he was hurt. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I couldn't just leave him out there. He needed me. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I took a step into the trees, shining the flashlight ahead of me. "Tom?" I called again, my voice shaking. "Where are you? Help me!" The voice came again, closer now, but wrong. It sounded like Tom, but not quite right, like someone was imitating him. A chill ran down my spine. The stories, the legends, they rushed back into my mind, flooding me with a dread I couldn't explain. But I kept moving, pushing deeper into the woods. The underbrush was thick, the branches clawing at my clothes as I stumbled forward. The further I went, the colder it got. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me like a weight, making it hard to breathe. "Tom!" I shouted again, my voice cracking. "Here!" His voice responded, barely a whisper now, so close I should have been able to see him. I swung the flashlight around frantically, the beam cutting through the darkness in wild arcs. And then I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. At first I thought it was Tom. He was standing there still and silent, his face hidden in shadow. Relief washed over me, and I started toward him, but something stopped me dead in my tracks. He wasn't moving. "Tom?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't respond, didn't even blink. I took a step closer, the flashlight shaking in my hand as the beam fell on his face. My breath caught in my throat. It looked like Tom, same clothes, same face, but there was something horribly wrong with him. His eyes were wide, too wide, staring at me with a vacant, dead expression. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. Just that blank, empty stare. "Help me," he whispered again, but the words didn't match the movement of his lips. The voice came from his direction, but not from his mouth. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This wasn't right. This wasn't Tom. Then he moved, not toward me. He twitched, his limbs jerking unnaturally, like a puppet whose strings had been yanked. His head cocked to the side, almost as if he was studying me, and I realized with growing horror that whatever I was looking at wasn't Tom at all. It was something else and wearing his face. I turned and ran, crashing through the trees, branches tearing at my skin, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. Behind me I heard the sound of footsteps, heavy, uneven, following me, gaining on me. "Help me," the voice called again, louder now, echoing through the woods. But it wasn't Tom's voice anymore. It was deeper, guttural, and wrong. I sprinted back to the camp, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the thing moving through the trees, crashing after me, its voice calling out again and again, twisting and distorting. "Help me, help me." I burst into the clearing, gasping for breath, and spun around to face the trees. The fire was still burning low, casting long shadows across the ground, but there was no sign of the figure, no sign of Tom. Just silence. I grabbed my gear, stuffing everything into my pack as quickly as I could, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip it up. I didn't care about the tent or the fire. I just needed to get out. I needed to get away from whatever was out there, wearing my friend's face. As I made for the trail, I heard the voice one last time, soft and distant. Help. Me. But this time, I didn't look back. I never saw Tom again. The search parties went out the next day combing the forest, but they didn't find a trace of him. Not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing, nothing. The official story was that he got lost, maybe injured, and succumbed to the elements, but I know better. Whatever is in those woods, it's still out there, and it's waiting. So if you ever find yourself deep in the forest and you hear a voice calling for help, do yourself a favor. Don't answer. I never believed in cryptids or any of that supernatural nonsense. My idea of a scary story involved a good thriller movie, maybe a haunted house tour around Halloween. Real-life horror was just, well, real. Bills, jobs, and responsibilities. But I'll never be the same after what happened on that camping trip last fall. It was supposed to be a solo trip, just me and nature. I needed a break from the grind, from people, from everything. The forest always helped me clear my head, and this time I was going deeper than ever before into the wilderness of Montana. No campsites, no trails, just a map, a compass, and miles of untouched forest. The first 2 days were bliss. The air was crisp, the forest was alive, and I didn't see a single soul. I pitched my tent on the third night at the edge of a small clearing. The sun was setting behind the trees, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, casting long shadows across the ground. As the darkness crept in, I built a fire and settled in with a book. The crackling of the fire and the soft chirp of crickets were the only sounds for miles. It was perfect. But that night, something changed. It started subtly. The fire was getting low, and as I went to throw another log on it, I heard something. It wasn't loud, just a faint rustling from the tree line. At first, I figured it was an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon scavenging. I didn't think much of it. Then I heard it again. This time it was louder, closer, twigs snapping. I turned my flashlight toward the woods, scanning the dense brush. Nothing. Just shadows and trees swaying in the wind. I shrugged it off, but the hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I sat back down by the fire. That's when I noticed it. Silence. The crickets had stopped. The wind had died down. The woods were unnaturally quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. And in that silence, I felt it. That creeping sensation. The one that claws at your gut and tells you something isn't right. Like eyes were on me. Watching. Waiting. I stood up, scanning the tree line again with my flashlight. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. Nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the light of my fire, hiding in the dark. I threw another log onto the fire, hoping the flames would push back the shadows, give me some comfort. But the feeling didn't go away. It only grew stronger. I tried to distract myself, went back to reading, but my eyes kept flicking up, scanning the woods. It felt like the darkness was pressing in, suffocating. A sudden loud crack snapped me out of my thoughts. My heart leapt into my throat, and I jumped to my feet, shining the flashlight toward the noise. I was sure I'd see an animal, maybe a bear lumbering through the underbrush. But there was nothing. Nothing except the faintest glimpse of movement. A shadow, impossibly tall, slipping between the trees. My stomach turned as I realized the shadow had been standing still, blending in with the trunks, watching me. It had only moved when the beam of my light swept over it. My breath hitched, and I stepped back toward the fire. The temperature had dropped suddenly, and a chill crept through me. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, the fire casting strange shadows. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was out there. I sat by the fire for what felt like hours, gripping my flashlight, my ears straining for any sound. The woods had come alive again, but not in the way I wanted. Every little noise, every rustle, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was getting closer. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, I woke to the sound of heavy breathing. It was faint but distinct, and it wasn't mine. My eyes snapped open and I stayed perfectly still, listening. The fire had burned low, barely more than embers now, casting long shadows that danced across the clearing. The breathing came again, deep, slow, and ragged, like it was coming from something large. I turned my head ever so slightly, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. And then I saw it. Just beyond the edge of the clearing, standing between two trees, was a figure. It was tall, too tall, towering over the bushes, its outline barely visible in the faint glow of the dying fire. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to make sense of it. At first I thought it was a person, but no human could stand that tall, not without some kind of unnatural distortion. Its limbs were elongated, unnaturally thin, and its head, God, its head, was wrong. Too narrow, almost like a deer's skull, but stretched and twisted. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. Just black, empty voids where its face should be. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe, my body was frozen with fear as the thing just stood there watching me. Then, without warning, it moved. It didn't walk. It didn't even seem to shift its weight. One moment it was standing still, and the next, it was gliding, sliding through the trees like a shadow, noiseless and impossibly fast. It circled the edge of the clearing, always staying just out of the fire's dying light. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I was rooted to the spot, my hands shaking as I clutched the flashlight. The thing kept circling, moving faster now, closer. Then it stopped, right at the edge of the firelight. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel it. It was waiting. Suddenly the fire flared, casting a brief flash of light, and for the first time I saw its face. It wasn't a deer, it wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. Its skin was pale and stretched too tight over its bones, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, sharp teeth glinting in the firelight. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were sunken, black pits, hollow and endless. In that split second, I knew I wasn't making it out of there. But then it did something I didn't expect. It turned its head slowly toward the woods behind me, like it had seen something. And then it ran. Not toward me, but away, vanishing into the trees without a sound. I didn't wait to find out why. I grabbed my pack, bolted for the trail, and didn't stop running until I reached my car, miles away. I don't know what that thing was, and I don't want to know. But I do know this. There was something else in those woods that night, something even it was afraid of. I've always loved camping. The quiet isolation of the deep woods, miles from anyone, nothing but the sound of wind through the trees and the crackle of a campfire. It's a kind of peace you can't find anywhere else. Or so I thought. This trip was supposed to be like all the others. A few days in the wilderness, far from the noise of the world. I had chosen a spot deep in the forest, a place I'd heard about from a friend. Said it was perfect for solitude, off the beaten path, not even marked on most maps. The kind of place where no one would bother you. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the towering pines. The air smelled earthy, rich with pine needles and damp moss. The trail was nearly invisible, overgrown and winding, as if the forest itself wanted to swallow it whole. That should have been my first warning, but I ignored it. I just wanted to set up camp before nightfall. By the time my tent was pitched, darkness had settled in. The fire cast long shadows that flickered like spirits dancing between the trees. I sat there staring into the flames, letting the quiet wash over me. It was peaceful at first, but the silence, it felt wrong. Too thick, like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. That's when I heard it, a rustling in the bushes maybe 20 feet away. I froze, straining to listen. Could have been a deer or maybe a raccoon. But then the rustling stopped, and I swear I heard something else. A low, raspy breath, almost human, but not quite. My stomach knotted up. "Hello?" I called out, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded small, fragile, like it was being swallowed by the forest. No answer. The fire crackled loudly, the only sound breaking the stillness. I shook it off, told myself it was just the wind or some animal, and forced myself to go to bed. But sleep didn't come easy. Every creak, every snap of a twig outside the tent set my nerves on edge. I lay there, eyes wide open, waiting, listening. Sometime after midnight I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. Someone, or something, was circling my tent. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, frozen, too terrified to breathe. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent flap. I stared at the zipper, expecting it to move. I don't know how long I lay there, waiting for whatever was out there to come inside. But eventually, the footsteps retreated, fading back into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. At dawn, I packed up my gear, ready to get the hell out of there. I figured it was just some animal, maybe even another camper messing with me, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. As I was throwing my pack over my shoulder, a voice behind me made me jump out of my skin. "You all right, son?" I whipped around to see a park ranger standing there, his uniform old and worn, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide ranger hat. "Jesus, you scared me," I said, trying to laugh it off. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just heading out." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Strange place to camp. Not many people come out this far. "I like the isolation," I replied, though my voice was shaky. "But I think I've had enough of it." The ranger tilted his head slightly, his smile fading. "Smart choice. These woods, they're different. Sometimes people come out here and they don't come back the same, if they come back at all." I tried to laugh it off, but his words hung heavy in the air. He didn't say anything else, just turned and walked back into the trees. I stood there for a minute, shaken, but I couldn't just stand there all day. I started hiking back down the trail, eager to put as much distance between me and the campsite as possible. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The woods felt wrong. The trees were too close, the shadows too deep. Every sound seemed amplified, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. And then I heard it again. Footsteps. At first they were distant, but they grew louder, faster, matching my pace. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the ranger, but no one was there. The forest around me seemed to blur, twisting into shapes that didn't make sense. Panic surged through me, and I started running. The footsteps followed, pounding the earth behind me, impossibly fast. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. The trail twisted, the trees a blur of dark green and brown, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was following me was getting closer. And then, out of nowhere, I burst into a small clearing, an old ranger station long abandoned. The door hung loosely on its hinges and the windows were cracked, covered in grime. I didn't think. I ran inside, slamming the door behind me. For a moment there was silence, nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then I heard it, a voice, soft and familiar. "Hello?" It was my voice, coming from outside. I froze, blood running cold. "Hello?" The voice called again, this time closer. "Are you all right?" I backed away from the door, heart pounding in my chest. The voice, my voice, was right outside. "Come on out, it's safe," it said, a twisted mockery of my tone. And then, almost like a whisper, "You can't hide from me." The door creaked, slowly. I backed into a corner, my eyes locked on the door as it swung open. And there, standing in the doorway, was me, or something wearing my face. It smiled, my smile. But its eyes, they were wrong. Too black, too empty, like twin voids staring back at me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The thing wearing my face stepped closer, that smile never faltering. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered, its voice distorting, breaking apart like static. "This place, it belongs to us now." I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear, but when I finally blinked, it was gone. The door was open, the woods silent once again. I ran. I ran harder than I've ever run in my life, not stopping until I reached the road where I'd parked my car. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. That was 2 days ago. I'm safe now, I think. But last night, as I lay in my bed, I heard something outside my window. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. And then, a voice. My voice. "Are you all right?" It's funny how the forest changes at night. I've been a park ranger for 10 years, and in that time I've come to respect the wild. The deep woods, especially. During the day, the forest is peaceful, even serene. Birds singing, leaves rustling in the breeze. But at night, that's when it feels alive in a different way. More aware. Last week I was assigned to patrol a remote part of the forest, a place known as Black Hollow. Not many campers venture out there, especially this late in the season. So when the call came in that someone had set up camp deep in the hollow, I wasn't thrilled. Black Hollow has a reputation, one that's passed down by generations of rangers. It's more folklore than anything, tales about strange lights, bizarre noises, and hikers who swear they've seen things moving between the trees. It's easy to brush off those stories until you find yourself out there alone. I left the station around 4 p.m., planning to check on the campers before dark and make sure they were set up safely. The sun was already dipping behind the mountains, casting long, slanted shadows over the trail as I hiked deeper into the woods. By the time I reached the area where the campers were supposed to be, the sky had turned a deep, dusky blue, and a thick fog had begun to settle in. I scanned the trees, looking for any sign of a tent or campfire, but there was nothing. Just endless rows of trees stretching into the mist. I radioed back to the station to confirm the location, but they insisted the coordinates were right. Someone was out here, or at least they had been. As I started walking deeper into Black Hollow, the feeling of isolation hit me hard. The woods felt claustrophobic, the trees packed tightly together, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. The trail became narrower, harder to follow, and then that smell hit me. Rot, like something had been dead for days. I'd come across my fair share of decomposing animals in the woods, but this was different. It was overpowering, almost sweet in its pungency, and it seemed to cling to the air. I pulled my flashlight from my pack, clicking it on as the last of the daylight faded. The beam cut through the fog, illuminating nothing but thick underbrush and the trunks of trees. That's when I saw it, a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, something darting between the trees, just beyond the reach of my light. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. Probably just a deer, I told myself, or maybe a raccoon, nothing to worry about. But then I saw it again, closer this time. Too fast for a deer, too tall. I called out, "Hello? Anyone out there?" Silence, the kind that makes your skin crawl. I moved forward cautiously, my hand resting on the hilt of the hunting knife strapped to my belt. As I reached a small clearing, I saw something that made me stop cold. A circle of stones neatly arranged with what looked like small animal bones scattered inside. Some were broken, others charred as if they'd been burned. A strange symbol was etched into the dirt at the center of the circle, one I didn't recognize. Goosebumps prickled across my skin. I'd heard stories about rituals and weird stuff happening in Black Hollow, but I'd always written them off as nonsense. Seeing it up close was something else entirely. I turned to leave to radio the station and report what I'd found, but just as I took a step back, a sound froze me in my tracks. A voice. No, not just any voice, my voice. "Help, over here." It echoed through the trees, distorted like it was being pulled apart and stitched back together again. But it was definitely my voice. I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the fog. There was no one. Just that oppressive mist, swirling between the trees. My skin felt tight, like I was being watched from all angles. I shouted again, "Who's there?" But my voice sounded small, swallowed by the woods. Then I heard it again, closer. "Help me, please." The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I realized something was very, very wrong. That voice wasn't a recording or some kind of trick. It was coming from the woods, but it wasn't just an echo. It was mimicking me, word for word. I backed away, my hand trembling as I raised the flashlight. Shadows shifted between the trees, long and twisted. Something moved just out of view, something tall. Its shape was vaguely humanoid, but wrong. Too lanky, too thin. Its arms hung lower than they should, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. It took a step toward me, and I saw its eyes, glowing, faintly yellow like embers in the darkness. I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran or in what direction, but the trees blurred together as panic surged through my veins. That thing, whatever it was following me. I could hear it moving quickly through the underbrush, always just behind me, always just out of sight. I burst through the trees into a small ravine, my legs burning from the sprint. I stumbled down a rocky slope and into a shallow creek, the cold water shocking my system. For a moment, everything was quiet. I stood there, chest heaving, trying to catch my breath, listening for any sign of the creature. And then I saw it, in the reflection of the water, standing behind me. It was tall, towering over me with grotesquely long limbs, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its face, or what passed for a face, was smooth, featureless, except for those glowing eyes. And its mouth. It had no lips, just jagged teeth exposed in a permanent grin. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. It was wearing my uniform, the same brown jacket, the same hat, and it was holding a radio. My radio. Before I could move, it spoke again in my voice. "Help me, please." It took a step forward, and I scrambled up the bank of the creek, slipping on the wet stones, adrenaline pushing me faster than I thought possible. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The sound of footsteps behind me faded, but I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, breathless and shaking. When I burst through the door, Dave, my colleague, looked up in shock. "You okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a half smile. I just stared at him, still gasping for air, and muttered, "There's something out there." Dave frowned, looking concerned. "You're not making sense. Here, sit down. You've been out there too long. But hey, at least you called in earlier, said you were on your way back." I froze. "What are you talking about?" Dave looked confused. "Your voice came through on the radio about 20 minutes ago. You said everything was fine." I slowly turned toward the window. The forest loomed outside, dark and silent. Whatever was out there, it wasn't done with me yet. There are places in the world that feel untouched by time, places where the line between the real and the unreal blurs. I learned this the hard way on a camping trip last fall. A trip I won't ever forget. A trip that changed everything. It was me, my friend Kyle, and his younger brother Ethan. We were headed to the Pine Hollow Reserve, a thick forest way out in the countryside, miles from any sign of civilization. Kyle had heard about a hidden trail there, one that supposedly led to an old abandoned cabin deep in the woods. We were all experienced campers, so the idea of exploring a forgotten place excited us. We left early that Saturday, eager to find this so-called hidden trail. When we arrived at the reserve, the usual paths were well maintained, but Kyle wanted something different, something off the beaten track. So we hiked deep into the woods looking for any sign of a trail that had been neglected or overgrown. By mid-afternoon we found it, an old narrow path barely visible under the thick canopy of trees. It was covered in leaves and branches, clearly unused for years. But there was something about it that drew us in, something that made us feel like we had to follow it. We hiked for what felt like hours. The forest around us grew denser, darker. The trees seemed to close in, their twisted branches casting long, finger-like shadows across the ground. The further we went, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, just the sound of our footsteps crunching through the leaves. Eventually, we found the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, hidden by the forest's dense growth. The wood was old and rotting, the windows shattered, the door hanging slightly ajar. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the lantern hanging by the door. It was old, rusted, but the flame inside flickered faintly, as if it had been lit just minutes before. "Who the hell is out here?" Ethan muttered, glancing at me and Kyle. None of us had an answer. We hadn't seen another soul the entire hike. "Maybe it's someone's idea of a prank," Kyle said, though his voice wavered. Still, curiosity got the better of us. We approached the cabin cautiously, our eyes on the flickering lantern. There was no sign of anyone inside, just dust, cobwebs, and the faint smell of something rotting. Ethan reached for the lantern. "Whoever left this must be around here somewhere. Maybe—" Before he could finish, the lantern went out. Just like that, the flame vanished and the clearing was plunged into an eerie twilight. It felt like the air got colder, heavier. I don't know how to describe it, but it was like something had shifted, like the forest had come alive and was watching us. "We should go," I said, my voice tight. Kyle nodded, and Ethan, for once, didn't argue. We backed away from the cabin, trying to retrace our steps down the trail. But the trail wasn't there anymore. The path we had come in on, the one we'd followed for hours, it was gone. No faint track in the leaves, no break in the trees. Just an unbroken wall of forest all around us. "Did we take a wrong turn?" Kyle asked, sounding more panicked than I'd ever heard him. "No," I replied, scanning the dense woods. "We didn't." The sun was sinking lower, and the shadows in the forest were growing longer. We had no choice but to keep moving, hoping we'd somehow find our way back. But as we walked, that feeling of being watched grew stronger. The silence around us was thick, oppressive, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Then we heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us. Slow, steady, just far enough away that we couldn't see who or what was following us. We turned, but there was nothing there, just trees and darkness. "Did you hear that?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking. "Yeah, we heard it," Kyle muttered, gripping the flashlight tightly. We picked up the pace, but the footsteps followed, always keeping just enough distance to stay out of sight. And then, in the distance, we saw it, the flicker of a light. A lantern. It was the same one from the cabin, swinging slowly between the trees, its flame glowing faintly in the growing darkness. But there was no one holding it. It moved on its own, gliding through the woods as if being carried by invisible hands. "Is that the same lantern?" Kyle whispered, though we all knew the answer. None of us moved. We just stood there frozen, watching as the lantern bobbed closer. That's when I saw him. A figure appeared in the light, just behind the lantern. Tall, impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs and a face I couldn't quite make out. His body seemed to fade into the shadows, his movements slow and deliberate, but his eyes, they were wide and dark, and they locked onto us. "Run," I whispered, barely able to get the word out. We ran. I don't think I've ever been so scared in my life. We sprinted through the forest, branches slapping our faces, the sound of our own breathing ragged in the still air. But no matter how fast we ran, I could feel it, the presence behind us. The footsteps growing louder, closer. Every time I looked back, the lantern was there, swinging slowly, the figure always just behind it, always watching. We ran until we couldn't anymore, our legs burning, lungs aching. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, the lantern had disappeared, the footsteps gone. But we were still lost. The forest felt endless, like it was swallowing us whole. The trees twisted in ways that didn't make sense. The sky above seemed darker than it should have been, and the silence. The silence was suffocating. "We have to keep moving," Kyle said, though he looked like he was barely holding it together. And so we did. We walked for hours, maybe longer, the woods stretching on forever. And just when I thought we were doomed, that we'd never find our way out, we stumbled onto the road. It was sudden. One minute we were surrounded by trees. The next we were standing on the old dirt road that led back to the reserve parking lot. Relief flooded through us. We didn't question it. We just ran. When we reached the car, the sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale light over the forest. We piled in, none of us saying a word, and Kyle floored it. We didn't talk about the lantern, not until a few days later, when I decided to look up the history of Pine Hollow Reserve. That's when I found the story. Years ago, a man had lived in the cabin near the river, a recluse, or so the locals said. He was known for wandering the woods at night with an old lantern, searching for something, though no one knew what. One night he disappeared and the cabin was left abandoned. But the legend remained. They called him the Lantern Man, a ghost said to haunt the deepest parts of the reserve, always searching, always watching. I don't know if what we saw that night was real, but I do know one thing. We weren't alone in those woods, and if you ever find yourself deep in Pine Hollow, and you see the flicker of a lantern through the trees, do yourself a favor. Don't follow it. And whatever you do, don't look back. I had always prided myself on being able to handle solitude. I thrived in it, really. It cleared my head and helped me think. So, when the idea of a solo camping trip hit me, it seemed like a perfect way to unwind. No distractions, no noise, just me and the wilderness. It was something I had always wanted to try, but I hadn't gotten around to it. Until now. I chose a spot I'd read about in some backcountry forums, one of those hidden gem locations that only serious hikers knew about. No marked trails, no campgrounds, just pure wilderness. The directions were simple enough. Head down an old logging road until it dead ends, hike west for a couple of hours, and you'll find a small lake surrounded by dense forest. I was sold. The drive took most of the day. As the road got rougher, I saw fewer signs of civilization until there was nothing but trees and sky. I reached the end of the logging road as the sun was beginning to set. With the last bit of daylight, I grabbed my pack and headed into the forest, following the vague directions I had printed out. By the time I found the lake, the sun had sunk low and the sky was a deep orange. The lake was small, almost perfectly round, its water dark and still, reflecting the towering pines that surrounded it. It was beautiful, isolated, perfect. I set up camp quickly, pitched my tent, and got a small fire going just as the last light faded from the sky. The forest around me was quiet, eerily quiet. There were no birds, no rustling of small animals, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional ripple on the lake's surface. I figured it was just because I was so deep in the woods, far from any trails or people. The animals were probably more cautious around here. As I sat by the fire eating my dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence felt too thick, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I told myself I was just adjusting to being alone in such a remote place. I wasn't used to this level of quiet. Still, it gnawed at me, that sense of something being slightly wrong. After a couple of hours of staring into the flames, I decided to turn in for the night. I put out the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped up my sleeping bag. The night was utterly black outside, the kind of dark where you can't even see your hand in front of your face. I lay there, listening to the nothingness, trying to let the steady rhythm of my breathing lull me to sleep. And then I heard it, a soft splash. My heart jumped and I strained my ears listening for more. At first I told myself it was just something falling into the lake, a fish maybe. But then it came again. Another splash followed by the faintest sound of something shifting, like wet fabric being dragged across the ground. I sat up, my pulse racing, ears straining to pick up any sound. The forest outside was still pitch black, the fire long since extinguished. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it toward the lake. Nothing. The water was still, like glass. The trees stood tall and silent, their reflections unbroken in the dark mirror of the lake. But that sound, it hadn't been my imagination. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response, just the steady hum of the wind through the pines. I scanned the beam of my flashlight across the shore, expecting to see an animal or maybe a tree branch that had fallen into the water, but everything looked untouched. I shook my head, trying to calm myself down. I'd been on edge all day, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Satisfied that there was nothing out there, I lay back down and tried to get comfortable again. But just as I started to relax, I heard it again. This time it was closer. A soft, deliberate splash followed by the distinct sound of something moving along the shore. Slow, wet footsteps. They stopped just beyond my tent. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare make a sound. I gripped the flashlight tightly in my hand, the beam still off as I lay there, listening to whatever was outside. For a moment there was silence, then a soft brushing sound like fabric dragging against the canvas of my tent. It was right outside. My mind raced. What was it? A bear? No, bears don't move like that. A person. But why would anyone be out here, at this hour, in a place so remote? And then I heard it. A voice. Faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Help. Me. It was a whisper, strained and distant, but it was there, just on the other side of the tent wall. My blood ran cold. I didn't know what to do. Everything in me screamed to unzip the tent and run, but I couldn't move, I couldn't even breathe. The voice came again, this time closer. Help! Me! Please! I sat up, my hands trembling, and flicked on the flashlight. I aimed it toward the tent flap, ready to confront whatever, or whoever, was out there. But the voice had fallen silent again. With shaking hands, I unzipped the tent, just enough to shine the flashlight outside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the shore of the lake. But there was nothing. No person. No animal. Nothing. The water was as still as ever, the trees unmoving. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I scanned the area again with the flashlight, feeling my heart pound in my chest, and that's when I saw it. Something glistening on the ground near the edge of the lake. I stepped out of the tent cautiously, my body tense, and approached the spot, keeping the flashlight steady. The closer I got, the more I could see. It was a wet, dark patch in the dirt, like something had been dragged out of the water and across the shore. The trail led to the lake, and as my eyes followed the path, I saw something floating just beneath the surface of the water. A face, pale, bloated, staring up at me with empty, lifeless eyes. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat, my mind reeling. The figure in the water didn't move, didn't blink, just floated there, half submerged, staring at me from the depths. I ran back to the tent, grabbing my pack and yanking it on. I didn't care about the rest of my gear. I didn't care about the fire or the tent. I just needed to get out of there. As I sprinted toward the forest, I heard it again behind me from the lake. Help me. The voice was louder this time, more desperate. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I don't know how long I ran, but by the time I reached my truck, the sun was just beginning to rise. I jumped in, slammed the door, and sped down the dirt road, not stopping until I was miles away from that lake. I haven't been back to that spot since. I don't tell anyone the full story when they ask why I've stopped camping alone. They wouldn't believe me if I did. But I still hear that voice sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment. Help me. I'd always been drawn to the idea of camping, getting away from the noise of the world, finding peace in the stillness of nature. But after this trip, I'm not sure I'll ever set foot in the woods again. It started innocently enough. I'd been itching for an escape, so when my coworker Ben told me about this hidden campsite deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, I was sold. He'd described it as untouched and perfectly remote, the kind of place where you could really disappear for a while. That's exactly what I wanted. I packed light and left early, arriving at the base of the trail mid-afternoon. The drive had been long, and the further I went, the less maintained the road became. By the time I reached the trailhead, it felt like I was miles away from any civilization. No cars, no people, just trees for as far as the eye could see. Exactly what I wanted. I strapped on my pack and started hiking. The trail was narrow, overgrown, and barely visible in some spots, but I wasn't concerned. I'd been given directions. Follow the river for 2 miles, then head uphill toward the ridge. Simple enough, and it was quiet. Too quiet, actually. As I moved deeper into the forest, I realized I hadn't seen or heard any wildlife. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. Just my boots crunching on the dirt and the distant sound of running water from the river. After about an hour, I found the spot Ben had described, a small clearing just above the riverbank, surrounded by tall, ancient trees. It was beautiful. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the canopy in golden beams, and I could hear the river gurgling below. I set up my tent and got a fire going. It was peaceful. But that peace didn't last long. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows stretched across the clearing, I began to feel uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I laughed it off. I was alone out here, there was no one to watch me, but the feeling lingered. After eating dinner, I sat by the fire staring into the flames. That's when I heard it, the first sign that something was wrong. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling fire, but unmistakable. A soft, rhythmic tapping sound, like someone was knocking on wood. I froze, listening. The sound seemed to be coming from deeper in the woods, but it was hard to pinpoint. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't fast and it wasn't frantic, just steady, almost methodical. I turned my head, shining my flashlight toward the sound. Nothing, just trees. But the tapping continued, now slightly louder, as if it were getting closer. Probably just a woodpecker, I muttered to myself, though I didn't believe it. There was something off about the sound, something deliberate. The tapping stopped. The fire crackled, and I realized how loud my own breathing had become. I sat there, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. But there was nothing, just darkness and the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I tried to calm down, convincing myself it was all in my head. After all, I was alone in the middle of nowhere. My mind was probably just playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was a heavy sensation, like a pair of eyes was locked onto me from somewhere in the trees. I decided to call it a night, figuring sleep would help reset my nerves. But as I crawled into my tent and zipped it up, I felt that same prickling sensation return, stronger this time. I lay there, staring at the fabric ceiling, trying to ignore it, but it only got worse. And then there was the tapping again, louder now, unmistakably close. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. It was coming from the edge of the clearing, just beyond the tree line. Tap, tap, tap. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the trees. Nothing. The sound had stopped the second I'd moved, but the moment I lowered the light, it started again, this time on the opposite side of the clearing. I whipped around, light flashing through the trees, but still, nothing. That's when I saw it. Movement. Just at the edge of the light's reach. A figure standing perfectly still between two trees. I froze. My hand shook as I tried to focus the beam, but the figure was gone before I could get a clear look. My mind raced. Had I really seen someone, or was it just the shadows playing tricks on me? I didn't wait to find out. Grabbing my pack, I stuffed everything I could into it, not caring about what I left behind. I just wanted to get out of there. But as I was stuffing my things into my bag, I heard something new. Not tapping this time, but a voice, a faint, distant voice calling out from the trees. "Help!" I stopped, my blood running cold. It sounded like a woman, weak and pleading. "Help me, please." It was coming from the direction of the river, where the trees were thickest. Every instinct I had told me to run, but the voice was so desperate, so fragile. I grabbed my flashlight and moved toward the sound, my heart racing. The voice was getting closer. "Please, help!" I stopped at the edge of the trees, shining my light toward the river. Nothing, no one. Just the flowing water and the endless stretch of trees. But the voice, it was still there, echoing through the woods, now impossibly close, yet I could see no one. Then the voice changed. It shifted, becoming lower, more distorted. "Help. Me." The word sounded wrong, twisted, like something was mimicking a human voice but getting it just off. Suddenly, the tapping started again, this time right behind me. I turned, my flashlight swinging wildly, but the light barely pierced the darkness. The tapping grew louder, faster, circling me now. My breathing quickened. I was surrounded by it. An invisible chorus of tapping and that awful voice, growing more inhuman by the second. And then I saw it. Between the trees, just beyond the edge of the clearing, was the figure again. This time it was closer, and I could see it more clearly. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its body twisted and wrong, like it had been stretched. Its face, if you could call it that, was a pale, featureless oval, and from it came that awful, distorted voice. "Help. Me." I ran. I didn't look back. I sprinted through the trees, the tapping and the voice chasing me all the way to the trail. I don't know how I made it back to my car, but by the time I slammed the door shut and sped down the dirt road, the tapping had finally stopped. I haven't told anyone about what I saw or what I heard. When I got back, I asked Ben about that spot, and he seemed confused, said he'd never been there before, never even heard of it. The directions, he said he'd never given them to me. And now every night when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear it again, faint, far away at first, but always growing closer. Tap, tap, tap.